Please join us for our third annual Leadership Circle Summit at Cognia's corporate headquarters in Alpharetta, Georgia, January 13th through the 15th, 2025. Learn pragmatic solutions from our expert keynote speakers, Amanda Ripley, A.J. Crabble, and Cognia's own president and CEO, Dr. Mark Elgart. Connect with other educational leaders to identify simple solutions to complex problems, share governance challenges, and establish critical professional networks that best support your work. Find out more about Cognia's Leadership Circle Summit at cognia.org or email us at leadershipcircle@cognia.org.
Ladies, gentlemen, educators, leaders, welcome to Leader Chat. I'm Jeff Rose. Today is going to be challenging for me. Not for our guest, and definitely not for you as the listeners or observers of this Leader Chat, because it's going to be a very, very interesting, intriguing conversation. The challenge for me is when I was preparing for this discussion, which is leading a movement of culturally responsive teaching, I found myself going right back to my teacher, principal hat. That was my lens. And so I'm preparing. I was, definitely, excuse my term, but kind of nerding out on this material. Then going back, I thought, how am I going to elevate this conversation to focus on leading this really complex and interesting work? Because obviously the show is specific to leading in the education realm, but it's going to be fun. And so we did find the expert on this topic, the expert. And so here, any minute, I'm going to be inviting Zaretta Hammond to the screen. And let me read her bio, and then we're going to dive in, because we need to hurry, because like I said, I could keep Zaretta for 3-4 hours if I wanted to, if the show would let me, and it doesn't, right? Because we would probably lose your attention after 3 or 4 hours, even though I would be super intrigued and engaged. Zaretta Hammond is a highly respected national educational consultant and teacher, educator with over 25 years of experience supporting teachers, instructional coaches, and school leaders. She's the author and of the influential and best-selling book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, Promoting Authentic Engagement and Rigor for Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Students, which explores the integration of neuroscience with culturally responsive teaching to promote meaningful learning. So you can probably already hear why this was hard to boil this down into a set of questions. A former high school and community college writing instructor, she has provided professional development for school districts and organizations nationwide, helping them advance equity, literacy, and culturally responsive pedagogy. Her work emphasizes the importance of understanding the science of reading and learning to improve outcomes for diverse learners. Ms. Hammond also contributes her expertise to the broader educational community through her advisory roles on the Research Committee for the Learning Policy Institutes Alliance, LPI. We've had a number of guests who contribute to that work as well. For the science of learning and development. She is widely recognized for making complex concepts about neuroscience and culture-responsive teaching practices accessible and actionable for educators, which is what drew me in, and I can't wait to talk about this content. So without further ado, Zaretta, I'm so thankful that you're with us today.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I read your bio. I miss things, not necessarily intentionally, but it's really impossible to get the nuance of a person in just a few paragraphs, as uncomfortable as that made you feel as I'm reading it. Here's the question. So what did I miss? What do you want our listeners to know about you? And then maybe even talk to us about your why, what continues to drive you in this work.
I think what I would add to that bio is, I consider myself a boots on the ground teacher that's doing research. I may not be the teacher of record for a classroom, but being able to get shoulder to shoulder to teachers, understanding what their challenge is in helping students level up their learning is really kind of the focus of my work. And being able to communicate that to leaders so that they can adjust their leadership is also a key part of that. So I would say that would be kind of a focus. The why behind it all is really about helping every student reach their full learning power. And we know from our own individual district data that a number of children are not achieving at the highest level. This was even pre-COVID. And I think the degree to which we can really understand that the path to closing achievement gaps and opportunity gaps is helping students to become more powerful learners. So that is my why. Getting that information, those tools and tactics in the hands of teachers, instructional coaches, and leaders.
Well, you heard about my challenge that we're going to both experience here, in that after reading the book, as well as this great article, Liberatory Education, watching a variety of your videos I've seen you do on YouTube, etc. Right now, I'm just like packed with information. So my challenge is, how do I help us talk about it in a way that, makes it digestible and pragmatic for our listeners and viewers? That being the case, since you wrote Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, I have to assume there's been an evolution post-publishing, right? So, this was written at a time that this didn't just come out. So there's been probably developing. How has this impacted your work, and what's the current workflow for you now? Do you find yourself helping teachers and leaders through how to embed these practices? What's the practicality in work that you're experiencing right now?
That's a great question. And I think the work right now, it's not that the work itself has evolved. I created the Ready for Rigor framework that tried to break down the process of culturally responsive teaching, because it's not a curriculum, right? It's not a thing in and of itself, but it's a constellation of practices, dispositions, instructional design that come together and the teacher can use in order to move students to the next level. We talk about the depth of knowledge wheel or Bloom's taxonomy. Well, we want students to actually move up those levels. And how do we do that? Means that we have to get the student, get the student to become a more powerful learner. So that has been where I've seen the gap. So folks have done book studies, but when they are trying to implement, they're implementing strategies and they're focused on the strategy implementation versus on helping students grow their capacity, their intellectual and cognitive capacity. So that's the gap I am trying to help folks close right now, the knowing doing gap. And that is what I'm writing about. My next book will be out sometime in 2025, and I'm really excited for it to be the companion to culturally responsive teaching of the brain in order to help people close this knowing doing gap.
I will tell you, though, that I appreciated it as from a leadership perspective, as well as maybe even as a past practitioner of it, the fact that it's not necessarily, a practice, right? It informs it. And I think that your research as it relates to especially what is linking it to what we know about the brain was really important for me to hear, because it creates this really instantaneous level of credibility of why do we need to know this from a pedagogy perspective, not just classroom to classroom, but even as a system. So that being the case, you mentioned that the book is for teachers, coaches, and instructional, leaders, maybe let's just say principals. You're also clear that the goal is for us to move students from being dependent learners to independent thinkers, which, by the way, now I'm going to use that term over and over and over. I really like that. But from a leadership perspective, how do we lead this work? How would you define their role, the leader role, in terms of setting the conditions for teachers to be able to truly lean in and ensure that their practices are aligned to what we know specific to your research?
I think this is the place where, this work starts. So the leader has to be able to set those conditions, right? Shape the path that they want teachers to go down and really think about how they are creating a culture of continuous improvement. I do think that means leaders have to get really clear on their understanding of culturally responsive teaching. Right now, I don't think all leaders are clear. Some think it's synonymous with anti racist education. Some think it's about relationships and motivation. Very few have taken up the instructional aspect of it, helping students process information so the content is stickier. And as it's stickier and kind of follows the first rule of the science of learning, which is all new learning must be coupled with existing learning. Once they understand that, they understand why schema and culture become really important, because the teacher can cover the content, but if she doesn't help students mix the new with the known, what they already know, their funds of knowledge, it does not turn into usable knowledge. It's just information floating around in their head that they may not retain. So the science of learning really tells us this notion of schema, which is kind of culturally oriented. And too often I find leaders are using culturally responsive teaching as a euphemism for talking about issues of race and racial politics in school. So leaders have to get really clear on their own messaging and when I'm working with leaders, I help them write their own scripts, right? So they can stay on message and then help everyone else stay on message and know how to correct people in community gently in a positive way when people start to take it in the wrong direction. So I think that's a key thing. Yeah.
Oh, let's beat this dead horse for a minute, because I think this is important. Because I can see it. The fact that when you take some level of terminology, culturally responsive teaching, we see happening in education all the time is that we start to define things very differently. Sometimes things get watered down. Sometimes they get ramped up. And before you know it, it lands in a political arena, which it is not. Right? And so talk to us about why you think this happens. And I think that's important that we understand the why so we can start thinking about then, therefore, like, what is the way for us to attack this as leaders? Why does this get so wrapped up? And sometimes the sound bites are so inaccurate relative to what you are teaching us, specific to the concept.
I think it really stems from, as educators, we continue to look for a silver bullet. We want a quick, turnkey process. And therefore, it has to fit into a particular soundbite. It has to be communicated quickly. We have to productize things so that we can spread it and scale it across a district. And when we do that, we have a tendency to water it down, or some of the most important elements are forgotten or left off. We saw this with growth mindset. Carol DeWick had to come back onto the scene and correct folks, and we still are misusing it. Marzano back in the day had to do that with the 9 essentials that he talked about. Again, I think the biggest challenge is when we start to look at who is being left behind, whose culture is not being used to mix the new and the known. And I don't mean in terms of relevance, topics in the curriculum. That's one aspect. The aspect that I talk about is how do we leverage the learning tools that students coming from collectivist cultures already know. They have schema in their brain for actually processing the information so it's stickier. And I think for leaders, that has to be the message. How are we making sure our students are processing information and it's stickier? We don't want them just to be independent thinkers, we want them to be cognitively independent learners.
I love the fact that you dispel in the book this assumption that a lot of people, even educators make, that this work that you describe is beyond mindset and grit, right? You describe it's important, but this is beyond that. And then I will tell you that back in the day as a principal of an elementary school, a long time ago, I remember being at this kind of interesting crossroads of being in a high poverty school where, say, literacy rates were definitely not what they could be or should be, and feeling as though for us to make progress, to get to the place where we could truly embed what I would envision, what we would all envision as teachers as the right instructional practices, we got to get kids to read first, right? The dilemma is what I just said, that we would sometimes focus. Now we would get pulled into this place of, let's get kids reading, and then. Because if they can read, it frees us up to do these right and deep instructional practices that they deserve. So I'm aware of that mistake. I'm bringing that mistake to the table because I think you describe why that is a mistake in this book.
Thank you for that, because I do think this is something really important for leaders to grasp. It's not one thing before the other, right? Because if you're thinking along those lines, you're thinking of culturally responsive teaching as a thing, as a curriculum. I want folks to understand it to be a turbocharger of whatever you are attempting to teach students. Let's take literacy, for example. Let's dig down deeper. If students don't master how long vowels work, then they're never going to really become proficient readers. Now, if we are taking a culturally responsive approach to teaching literacy, reading skills, long vowel agility, then we know that students have to internalize those sound spelling correspondences, the different ways to make the long A. This is where you would use some of those culturally responsive practices to process, to check for internalization, to lift up retrieval practice. A lot of the things we know that are congruent with the science of learning are already embedded in kind of these collectivist approaches to learning. And so this is one of the things that I talk about in culturally responsive teaching in the brain, is this idea of how are we getting students to chew? But the thing to know even before that, right, chew on the content so that they're mixing the new and the known. But even before that, what we know from social neuroscience is that the student does not feel a sense of belonging, connection, intellectual safety, they will not allow themselves to make mistakes. So if in front of others who they think they're going to be judged or ridiculed. So this idea of relationship and psychological safety becomes so important and intertwined with the learning. So when we start to think about kind of culturally responsive teaching, is not separate from the content we need to teach. It's the turbocharger that allows our instruction to actually help the student do these internal cognitive operations. And by doing those operations, they become more powerful learners. These are the learn how to learn skills that we're not teaching them, so that ultimately the student can teach themselves anything. They can learn any new content. That's the holy grail. But we are getting caught up in culturally responsive teaching as almost a character type curriculum, right? Versus the turbocharger of instruction. So I love that you're making that point about the connection. And that starts with the leader. If the leader is not signaling that our children aren't reading, therefore, we need to take a deeper look at our instruction. How are we making sure students internalize it? How are we making our content sticky? This isn't the teachers teaching harder. This is the teacher and the student working together in the symbiotic relationship that is teaching and learning. If the student isn't learning, then are we really teaching?
And you'll be thankful to know that from a leadership perspective, I did one day turn that corner of making sure that, and learning myself, that if we try to focus on, well, let's get students to a particular place, like so that they have the building blocks in order to learn what we would really want them to learn. Eventually I came to this conclusion, we came to it together, that we will never get there. If we continue to think, well, we're going to grind and really push on just the fact on these basic skill sets of literacy and focus on the grit of the student as opposed to align it to their needs, then we will just never get there, and we'll never be able to do the kind of instruction we think they deserve. And out of your book, now I'm not going to rank the things that I thought are most important, but this I thought was really important. And you really focus on this, understand the need for us as educators to understand culture and the varying levels of culture and socio-political context, which, by the way, I was so thankful that you continued to bring this up. So can you explain why this is so foundational for, of course, educators, but also leaders to understand the importance of this?
Yeah, I think the idea of culture operates, and this is where the research is out there. This isn't me making this up. This is what I attempted to do in this book, is to bring the research that has been out there for a long time into a practical realm. This is how we can use this information about culture. So culture operates at three levels. There's a superficial level. We call that the surface level, and that's usually the artifact. So we're going to have kente cloth, and we're going to have some artifact or songs or elements of each student's culture. And that's kind of a multicultural approach, or it's a small world approach, I call it. Then there's shallow culture, and it's shallow not because it's less than, it's shallow because it's just underneath the surface. These are all the hidden rules, unspoken rules. All you need to do is travel to another country, and there are all these rules no one tells you about: how close you stand to other people, how you interact, what's appropriate behavior on the metro, or, do you talk to people in the street or not? So part of that, in terms of understanding how that operates in school, is to understand that it's oriented around an individualistic culture. Doesn't make it bad. A Eurocentric culture doesn't make it bad. It just means that it is not actually the schema that a large number of our students, particularly in majority minority environments, are coming to school with. So this is where the leader, the teacher, they have to widen their own aperture so that they really understand who the students are, so they know kind of how to not just connect on a personal level, but connect the content to what the student already knows and understands about it, and then be able to use the techniques for mixing that in their working memory. So I do think there's a way in which we have to continue to think about kind of the psychological safety, the productive struggle. That's the new buzzword, right?
Yeah.
Productive struggle. And this is so connected to creating a container where the students can engage in that productive struggle.
Well, let's pause, because I want to. The struggle piece I think is important, because I don't have the level of depth of understanding specific to brain research that you do, but what we know is this: we actually know that people learn at the highest levels when there is a level of discomfort that they're experiencing, as long as, right, there's safety. Right. So we know when students, or even teachers, educators, leaders, et cetera, when they're uncomfortable and don't feel safe, then that creates this whole, fight or flight scenario. But when they're struggling and they feel safe simultaneously, then it creates optimized opportunity for us to learn. And I know way more about you than you know about me. So let's just sum up. I've been around the block a little bit as an educational leader, fair enough to say. And I've been exposed to, of course, brain research, not enough to write a book on it, and the implications in terms of our instructional practices. And I've done a lot of work on issues of cultural competence, et cetera. But your book did something I think was very unique, which it tied this level of detail in terms of the role of culture and how that has a role in one's brain and thinking strategies. And so I'm curious, is there a shortage of research on this topic? Because I thought that making that connection was so important to me, just as a leader and a learner, even though I've been exposed, but making the connection for the two was really eye-opening.
I don't think there's a shortage. I do think there is a shortage of bringing particular research into the realm of education. And for a variety of reasons, we have not leaned into that. I see the same thing happening with change management. So when I'm working with leaders, a lot of times that's what we're talking about. If you are experiencing test scores that are kind of reinforcing inequity. The same kids are at the top, the same groups of students are at the bottom. Black, brown, indigenous, poor students of all colors are at the bottom. And it's not changing. You're going into year 7, year 8, you're looking at 30% reading proficiently. Like, these numbers are so consistent. Then the leader has to step back and say, well, what do we need to shift? What needs to happen? So a lot of times in my conversation with leaders to kind of, how are you going to bring this content to your teachers? We have to employ a change management for equity strategy, right? And this means you've got to understand how change happens. Rogers' diffusion of innovation, right? The Heath brothers have talked about the switch framework, shaping the path, motivating the emotional parts of humans, and they talk about that as motivating the elephant, directing the driver. This is the technical change we used to talk about back in the day, adaptive versus technical change. For some reason, we have not braided all these together. We keep them in silos, and the leader's job is to braid them together. In reading, we have Scarborough's reading rope. That kind of revolutionized how we started to approach the science of reading, even when we were not calling it the science of reading, right? These strands, and those strands were braided together. And then there were 3 big multi-strands that, we braided those 3 together. Well, culturally responsive teaching in many ways is a similar thing. And one of those strands is going to be change management. How do you get people to stop doing what is not effective, because we know it's not effective, we can see the result of that, and start doing other things? This is what John Hattie's work is about. You can just look at the effect size of something. I was just working on a chapter for my new book and going back into Hattie's research, and he just talks about this notion of cognitive task analysis, helping students to not only struggle productively, but to be metastrategic when they do it, right? And metastrategic is different from metacognitive. We talk about that. So being metacognitive is just being aware, but it doesn't give you new skills or new understanding of how to change your learning moves. So when we couple productive struggle with the student's ability to be more metastrategic, through the teacher's coaching, because they're in a container of safety where that struggle is productive. Not all struggle, just because it's struggle doesn't mean it's good. And we don't have to protect students from that struggle just because they may have a high number of ACEs or trauma experiences. One of the beauties of the research is we know there is post-traumatic growth, that this work, when students are feeling like they're making progress, that they're struggling productively, is actually protective to their regulating through trauma, right? We have a tendency to delay this, like, oh no, they're too delicate to get in here and do this. So I think leaders really have to understand how to bring a variety of different research bases into kind of braiding together what it means to be a school that is culturally responsive, has instructional equity, is actually moving the needle on disrupting kind of the predictability of who's at the top, who's at the bottom, particularly when we think about core things like reading proficiency.
Let's keep digging on a little bit on the concept of struggle. I think this is important. You wrote that sometimes we over-scaffold, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than coach students to engage in productive struggle, right? To process content. So liberatory practices, this article that I read that you wrote, however, focuses on student independence. So talk to us about that bridge from sometimes our ability to, or our over scaffolding to try to get the students to this sweet spot of productive struggle with this focus on student independence.
Yeah, I think it's a little more complex than we would like it to be. And herein lies the big challenge. It's not an either or. Either I'm over scaffolding or I just take these scaffolds down and then, let the student be independent. So one of the things that I'm talking a lot about this because it is what I see as the biggest challenge, right? Teachers, particularly as they have been instructed through leadership and district central office mandates to include high quality grade level materials to students. And yet still, we know a number of students may be a year or more behind in reading proficiency, so that by themselves, they cannot access those materials. So what we see is out of some good intention is this over scaffolding to move students along. But here's how we know that that's not an equity move, because without the teacher's scaffolding, the student could not access them by themselves. How we know the work around scaffolding, engage in productive struggle, learning how to learn skills, is that once the teacher starts the scaffold, they are very clear with the student. I'm here so that in the next 6 weeks, 8 weeks, pick a number, we are going to fade this scaffold. If you're giving the student sentence frames, well, we're going to fade these sentence frames, and here's how we're going to do this in a step-by-step process. So it's not kind of an all or nothing. It's not either they're being independent or they are being over scaffolded. We're scaffolding with the expectation of fading, the gradual release of responsibility. But a lot of teachers have not learned that in their teacher training. We're not emphasizing the fading of a scaffold as a core equity practice. Like, I need to make sure the student can stand on their own 2 feet. And what I find really interesting about that, Jeff, is I'm a parent, and I know there are other parents out there, leaders are parents too. And if you've parented a child to adulthood, what you know is my job is to actually make sure by the year 18, they can actually stand on their own 2 feet, and that there are some basics they can do. Wash their own clothes. Now, halfway through that, when they start to do their own laundry, you're going to get some pink clothes. Nobody's upset. And there's an opportunity to coach them about separating.
Well, people get upset. You're wrong about that.
We, as parents, we can get upset for a moment, but we know we can rescue them. I'm not doing your clothes, right? But This is the analogy I want to make to what we should be doing in education. When we are looking at instruction, it should be coaching the student toward building these muscles, building these skills, building these dispositions, these cognitive routines, but we're not doing that. We're talking about standards, covering the content, and scaffolding so students can get through these materials, as if high quality, grade level materials by themselves are magical. That's magical thinking. And that, unfortunately, is the space we're in. And we're not creating the opportunities for productive struggle, or even for teachers to understand what that is. If we had more time, I'd break that down, like, here are the 4 elements, because that's what I do in the new book that I'm writing, right? And the title of that book is Rebuilding Student Learning Power, Teaching for Instructional Equity and Cognitive Justice. Because the liberatory education part of that is, if we don't help the student to be a powerful, cognitively independent learner, when they go to the next grade, they're going to struggle again, and they're going to look toward the teacher to do that scaffolding. So this should be a conversation in PLCs. It should be something that the principal is looking out for when they're doing their walkthroughs. Is there too much scaffolding? I see that principals aren't on the lookout for that. And that in PLCs, they're not working on how do we fade those scaffolds, right? How are we simultaneously building student capacity? Because you can't fade the scaffold until the student has learned it, right? We can think Karate Kid, Mr. Miyagi, it's like wax on, wax off. He was making sure that Daniel could do these practices as he was building his capacity to actually be proficient in karate. And to Daniel's surprise, oh my goodness, I can do this. That's what we want to see in our students, but we're not setting them up for that kind of success.
I remember at times when I was sitting in the leadership seat, finding ourselves at times in this kind of wrestling match specific to what we're focusing on for our students. And I remember at times saying, or trying to remind our people, our goal is not to help students become good in school or good at school. That's not our goal. Our goal is to prepare them they can navigate this very complex world successfully because they have the independent thinking skills to do so. Not necessarily mastery just for mastery's sake. At times, it's very easy for educators, teachers, loving ones, to become uber focused on a specific skill set as opposed to creating an understanding on why that skill set is important for the future of the student, as opposed to sometimes even just what we're accountable for or even our past. So it is interesting. And I want to back up because this reminds me of something that a term that I really appreciated. You talked about learning partnerships. Can we back up a little bit? And can you talk to us about that? Because that was also really powerful for me.
Well, and I think it's the bridge between what we were just talking about.
Yes.
So the idea we keep in mind is we want students to struggle productively. We learn from our errors. We learn through mistakes. But if the student is not, strategic in looking for ways to improve their moves, they're not going to make those changes. So this learning partnership is very much like Mr. Miyagi in Karate Kid and Daniel, right? It's kind of a cognitive apprenticeship. And that partnership starts with rapport. It's the warmth, the getting to know someone, and just having a personal interest in them. It's that rapport that we want to build with the student. But we want to use that rapport that we build with the student to escort them into their zone of proximal development. Now, here's the rub. They're not going to want to go. So this means that we're not just being friendly to be friendly. We're now using that friendliness, the warmth, the trust that they've given you to push them, right? And so to push them, students need care and push. And so this becomes really important when we start to think about how we're going to support students in that learning partnership, which brings us to the second element. The second element is alliance. And that means the student and the teacher together have understood this is where the push part comes. This is where the student is going to actually practice, that productive struggle, and mixing the new and the known, stretching themselves, grappling. And then the third part of that is through this process, the teacher will get cognitive insight. The student will be vulnerable and kind of show them where they're getting stuck or where the challenges are for them. And that teacher now can be the coach to help the student move through these tricky parts. That's not what we're doing right now. And for leaders, here's a piece I would add to that. Leaders with pacing guides need to accommodate productive struggle. They need to accommodate the learning partnerships where teachers actually need to have instructional conversation with students, where students are getting feedback, where students can talk about their learning moves. A lot of teachers complain they don't have time for the kind of innovation that we know is going to lead to the kind of outcomes. So we try to truncate that or work around it or kind of reduce it to its lowest common denominator, and then it doesn't work. And then folks say, well, we tried that. So we're really not even giving practices like productive struggle or culturally responsive teaching a fair shake because we as leaders don't want to reimagine what a pacing guide looks like. It should accommodate for these things.
So I still have some more questions on this very thing. So just give me a second now. But real quick, observer, listener, I'm going to take a quick break for Chris. Chris has some words for us. Then we're going to dive right back in. So just a moment. Chris, over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Richard, and I'm the producer of the Leader Chat with Jeff Rose podcast, brought to you by Cognia. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't done so already, please make sure you follow or subscribe to us if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or Podbean to make sure you're getting all the latest updates on the newest episodes. You can also check out our video episodes under our Cognia YouTube channel. Please make sure you check those out and leave us a like or a comment and let us know how we're doing. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. Back to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. Okay, so Zaretta, let's dig in here. I want to talk about leadership strategies and tactics that you've seen that are effective in terms of ensuring that culturally responsive teaching and practices are embedded in the school and district culture. And for our listeners and observers, culture, this is the way I define it. I stole Roland Barthes from a long time ago definition where he said, the way we do things around here, that's culture, right? So if we think about how we embed these practices in the culture of the system, meaning school and district, what have you seen leaders do that works and helps it become sticky as you describe?
Well, I think the number one thing is really embracing the instructional leader role. And that means being in conversation, not just about the implementation of new practices, but the thinking together about how do we get the student to become metacognitive and then metastrategic. And so a lot of that takes place in professional learning community. If you have PLCs, they're leaning into DeFore's third question, right? The first question is, what do we want students to know and to be able to do? Second question is, what will we do? How will we know when they've learned it? And the third question is, what will we do when they don't learn it? And I think being able to lean into that question in professional development and in professional learning community, where you're really doing collaborative inquiry. John Hattie's effect size says that collective efficacy, getting smarter together, is a turbocharger. It's going to lead to acceleration, more than a year's growth in a year's time, when teachers can couple that with helping students do cognitive task analysis, looking at a task and understanding what internal operations and what strategies and tools that they've been given by the teacher, what should they be using? Those two things together are turbochargers. So an instructional leader would be asking, how are we understanding which aspect of culturally responsive teaching we should be working on? The Ready for Rigor framework that I created breaks that into 4 quadrants. So just to say, oh, we're working on culturally responsive teaching, I always ask, what part are you working on? Because you can't be working on it all together. And this is where the leader helps people understand, just like Scarborough's reading wrote, how are we braiding these together versus just using the term culturally responsive teaching? Because if you do that, you're not going to go anywhere. That's just a blanket statement versus we're helping them become better information processors. So we're building an alliance so that we can give students care and cognitive push at the appropriate level with productive struggle. We're helping them become a community of learners, right? So when you can focus that instructional leadership around getting that pillar in place, and all teachers are kind of coming together around that with their practice and coming together to do inquiry, becomes a powerful thing.
You know, Zaretta, back in the day when I wrote my dissertation on collaborative practices, and I'm truly very passionate around systems and structures on how educators collaborate. It used to drive me nuts when people would use terms inappropriately, such as they'd say, "Oh, we're collaborating on this," but it was like this abuse of the C word. No, you're not. That's not collaboration right there. Let's back up and talk about what it is and what it isn't, et cetera. It was like this constant teaching and reteaching. Now that said, the systems that we have in place for our members, our leadership circle members, they're all round table processes, right? So we say circles are better than rows. They're all round table, discourse-oriented leaders helping other leaders. This is the one thing that we do that is really kind of pushing out content to them. So if you were to pretend, here we are around a table, and with us are superintendents and principals and everything in between. And we're having this discussion on culturally responsive teaching. If you were to say, okay, here's my drop the mic moment, my elevator speech, my 30 seconds on what advice you would have for them. This is the kind of the final, this is what I want you to hear loud and clear. What would you say? Ready, go.
I would say that you should focus on students over strategies. It may appear to be easier to talk about implementation of strategies, but you have to get clearer on helping teachers focus on students, to move the student, to teach the student learning how to learn skills in addition to the content. And what that means for leaders is reimagining what the pacing guide looks like. That won't happen in a week or a month. It may not even happen in a year, but it is a worthy conversation to marry the movement toward standards through the content with what the science of learning tells us through that culturally responsive lens as well. How do you meet the student where they are with their schema? Build on that to take them where we know they need to be in terms of their learning prowess.
Zaretta, I want you to know how much I know you are appreciated beyond this conversation, because this is why. I read a lot, right? I'm exposed to a lot of theory and concepts and incredible leaders. And this, your work and research really, really pulled me in. And so I think this conversation that we're having is going to help intrigue a lot of educators and leaders. And I appreciate your just very frank advice and pragmatic way of moving this content into the face of leaders and educators. Thank you so much for what you do.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our paths will cross again, Zaretta, I promise. Ladies and gentlemen, we just touched. I mean, even though this was an in-depth conversation, know that the text, culturally responsive teaching in the brain, I will be looking forward to Zaretta's new book coming out very soon. And when that is the case, I will read that as well. But I would recommend you go deep like I did, because I could have kept her here for hours. I'm so thankful, of course, for her. I want to say thank you, educators, leaders, for the noble work that you do. Be well.